Welcome to the June 2011 Broadband Breakfast Club, the National Broadband Map, Policy, Consumer, and Economic Development Implications. And I'd first like to thank the sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast Club. That's the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, ICF International, Telecommunications Industry Association, TIA, and US Telecom. Please give a hand to the sponsors of the Broadband Breakfast Club. And now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. That's Ann Neville. She's the Program Director of State Broadband Data and Development Program, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which is part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. Ann is responsible for the development of the National Broadband Map and oversees the grants program to support broadband data collection and state broadband capacity and leadership efforts in all 50 states and U.S. territories. Ann has extensive experience in legislative and regulatory environments, focusing on broadband, digital inclusion, and internet issues. Prior to the NTIA, Ann served as a Global Leadership Fellow at the World Economic Forum in Geneva, Switzerland, where she focused on IT and telecom issues. Ann also served as Assistant Secretary for Economic Development and Technology for the state of California, where she was lead staff to California's Broadband Initiative. Please join me in welcoming Ann Neville.
Thanks very much. I'll put it out when it's time. Morning, everyone. Let me begin first by thanking Broadband Breakfast for holding today's event. And I think the next thing I want to say is that it's really a great time to be a broadband geek. More than a decade ago, when I was an AmeriCorps volunteer running a community center in San Diego, I had no idea how to quantify the broadband availability problem because I didn't have any data that was granular enough. This was a problem when we went to policymakers and we were trying to talk about the importance of broadband. It was a problem when we were trying to write grants because we were full of anecdotes, but we didn't have any data that was systematically collected. And it was a problem when we were trying to help our clients learn about their broadband and their internet options, because if you didn't advertise, we didn't really know who you were, and we didn't know if you served the blocks that our clients lived on. Today, if I were that same AmeriCorps volunteer trying to expand broadband in an underserved area, I would be able to actually answer these questions. There would be times when I would probably find that the data still needs improving, but for the first time, I would not only have a baseline, but I would also have the opportunity to engage and provide feedback about the data set. If I wanted to convince City Council that it should support a local broadband planning team, I could create a summary that showed how our community compared to other communities of similar demographics, population, age, income. If I didn't like the way the data was cut online, I could download a portion or all of the 25 million records, and I could analyze them, find their strengths and weaknesses, and report on them. The reason I'd be able to do this is the topic of today's breakfast, which is the National Broadband Availability Data Set and the very powerful front end to that tool, the National Broadband Map. Congress rightly realized that in order for us to really increase broadband access and adoption in our communities, we needed better data on broadband infrastructure. And the data set, the National Broadband Availability Data Set, really provides an unprecedented amount of information on high-speed internet access in the U.S. NTIA created the National Broadband Map, for anyone in the room not familiar with it. We created the National Broadband Map in collaboration with the FCC and in partnership with 50 states, 5 territories, and the District of Columbia, each of which gathered and validated data from broadband providers and public and private sources. I am not trying to imply that the map and the data set are the only reasons that it's a good time to be a broadband geek. But these two products, from how they were developed to how we published them, are really emblematic in a shift from a data desert more than a decade ago to an environment today where we are nearly swimming in broadband data. The proliferation of information and data across all sectors is creating significant changes and opportunities. And Dr. Robert Groves is he's the director of the U.S. Census Bureau. And I read their blog a lot. And he recently published a post that really eloquently, I think, described the issue that we're dealing with. He coined two terms. One was design data, and the other was organic data. And each is useful, and each really has a lot of shortcomings. Organic data is created through, as he calls it, systems that automatically track transactions of all type. So organic data may collect troves of information, but some information may be missing, and we don't necessarily know what it is. Examples in this space could be browser or toolbar-based speed tests. In contrast, design data is that which is created through surveys or censuses, usually with a pre-specified purpose or use in mind. So again, in our space, an example might be the Public Library Connectivity Survey. Design data is typically much more limited in volume, but it is more structured overall. It ends up being more complete. So the National Broadband Availability Data Set is an example of design data. We went out with a purpose and intention in mind of collecting specific information to collect the entire census, essentially, of that. Each of our 56 state partners in the program sought the exact same set of information about broadband availability, and we captured over 25 million records, one for each unique combination of census block or road segment, broadband provider, type of technology deployed, and using 9 different tiers of speed, the highest advertised upstream and downstream speeds. We also captured significant information about schools, libraries, and hospitals, and the broadband that they use at their facilities. Our purpose in collecting the data was to meet our congressional mandate, which was, quote unquote, to develop a map that depicted existing broadband capability and availability in the United States. That was our mandate. That's what we were sent out to do. And one of the pieces as we've gone through this that we've realized, and I was talking with Bill earlier, is that I think sometimes folks think that what grantees sent us or we put together is just kind of like a big Excel spreadsheet. And so I brought this, which you can see sort of is really large. And this is the example this is the data model. So this is the combination of all of the different types of data that are to be collected through the program and represent all the different records that we have. And as you can see, there's a ton of stuff in here. And I think I really wanted to just make this point to help underscore how structured the data set was that's being collected and how much different types of information are included. Oh, you can look at it after and we can provide a copy. You're really excited. Sorry, messed up the mic by doing that. So you can download the entire data set online. You can view the information through the National Broadband Map. You can search by address, and we do recommend searching by address, not by city, not by zip code, search by address. And you can see the broadband availability, the broadband that's available in a specific neighborhood. You can view the data on a map. You can get a bird's eye view. You can zoom down. And we have a number of other interactive tools that allow you to take the broadband data and compare and contrast it with demographic information. In addition, because we knew that stakeholders, that public and private sectors, folks would want to add other data elements, we made all of the data available via API. In fact, that's how from the beginning, how we structured the entire data set. And we also, we included some third-party information on the interactive site. And we believed, when we looked at this, we did it very judiciously, but it was information that we thought would be useful for users who were using the site. And one of the challenges that we had is that this whole room probably represents 1 or 2 of our use cases. We at one point came up with 13, 14 different very specific uses that we thought folks were going to be using the map for. So we really were trying to create a platform that would be able to service all of the different people who had an interest in coming to this website. So one of the things that we included was organic speed test data, which was collected through Ookla and MLab through the FCC speed tests. And if you go to the summarized section of broadbandmap.gov, you can see the broadband availability characteristics for multiple units of geography. It goes from a as small as census, not census blocks, but sort of census areas, all the way up to the state level. And we wanted to add that in so that people could have a sense of what those speed tests had said. But we provided them in a very specific way. You had the mean values, and you also had all of the quartile values. And while we don't consider this a proxy for typical speed, at the record level, each test represents an experience of sort of one user at one time. And from that one test, we don't know. We can't be sure of the service to which the customer is subscribing. But we think the value, we saw a value in the data, and that's why we included it in a specific part of the map. So we wanted to get information to stakeholders quickly and efficiently, and we wanted to make the data usable and shareable. The map also allows users to easily mash up information. So the data set, it's available for download. Researchers can analyze it. They can do research on it. And we're very excited because when we launched the site, at this point 4 months ago, so it's been 4 months since we launched, and in that short period of time, there have been multiple companies, multiple government agencies, and multiple research organizations who've used the data. We're seeing it mashed up against business broadband infrastructure. Researchers have released initial data that's comparing the data across cities and across urban and rural communities. And government agencies, including the FCC and the Department of Education, have begun to incorporate the data into their analyses. So you can see in only 4 months, we're already having a huge use of the data and a lot of feedback about the data and how we can continue improving the data set. So we're using that data, we're using that feedback to help us as we move forward and we continue planning. State grantees, I think, really epitomizing that old saying about states being the laboratories of innovation, have already started pioneering new data validation techniques. They are working in work groups, differentiated by technology type so that they can identify and synthesize the best new techniques in broadband validation. And we are also assessing at a national level and with our state partners how to better identify different types of providers. For example, those that are primarily business or those that are primarily residential. And now I want to talk about pricing for just a minute. We understand the interest in collecting pricing data at the same level of granularity as our availability data. At this point, however, we have not yet seen a proposal for collecting pricing data that reflects the challenges of the marketplace that we live in, which is price packages change frequently, our availability data changes only twice a year, and is already several months out of date when we publish it. And the reality is that since prices do change more frequently, there just isn't an easy apples-to-apples comparison. And we've not turned a blind eye to this. This has, in fact, been a challenge that we have been thinking about from the beginning, and it's why many of our grantees proposed in their amended applications last year to dedicate staff time to looking at different types of ideas for gathering pricing information, generally from public sources. As importantly, if a third party has an idea now how to marry our data with pricing data, they can do so. That's why the data is available. Like the businesses, the agencies, the researchers, everyone who's already been using the data, it's ripe for use and it's ripe for innovation. And so the idea of innovation leads me to cost. The cost for the 56 states to gather availability data twice a year, validate that data continuously throughout the year, collect adoption data from community anchor institutions twice a year, and maintain state programs to analyze and access state-specific data, combined with the national costs of reviewing, monitoring, publishing the data onto the National Broadband Map is about $40 million a year. In fact, the website, the National Broadband Map, which I think is what we tend to call this all as the shorthand, that's the vernacular we've all adopted. The National Broadband Map, the cost for that is just a small percentage of that entire $40 million annual cost. And one of the things that I hope everyone in this room will take away from today's discussion, both my talk and I think I would guess what you're going to hear from a lot of the speakers, is that websites can be relatively inexpensive, but good data and research are not. So it's important to also note here that about 40% of the funding provided under the State Broadband Initiative supports state-driven broadband activities that were envisioned under the Broadband Data Improvement Act. And while it's not the focus of today's talk, though we'd be happy to talk about it with anyone, I want to impress upon everyone that doing these activities well, whether we're talking about state broadband task forces or whether we're talking about community broadband planning teams, community teams, means relying on the availability data set to help drive policymaking and help drive these leadership activities. And that means that the data that we've collected, it's not just being used to put on the map. It's being used at state levels. It's being used at local levels. It's being used in many different ways. There's the data set, and then there's the map. And I kind of want to make that point. Just two really great examples. In the last couple of months, both the states of New York and Maine, and some of the other projects that we funded, both had adoption projects, both had adoption surveys that they did. I think in New York it was 3,000 people across the state of New York in urban and rural communities, and have put out some really interesting and exciting reports looking about how their states should move forward, and marrying that with the data that they collected through the availability, through the broadband availability data set. So we're going to be publishing our next set of data in August. This is the data that was collected at about the same time that the map went live in February. And in addition, on June 30th, in just about 10 days, grantees are going to start gathering and validating the data that's due in October 2011. And so it continues to be, and has never stopped being, a very busy time, and we're working to improve and enhance our process. The initial data set was culled from information provided by broadband providers, third-party data sets, engineering assessments, community meetings, wireless drive testing, and a host of other sources. It is the most extensive data set of its kind, and it's publicly available and free to use, as it should be. So it's really a great time to be a broadband geek. We're very excited. And we also think that it's a great time to be a broadband stakeholder. There is and there will continue to be more and more information to find and to test, information that will help us learn more about the marketplace. The data set and the map represent a tremendous step forward in understanding where we are and how much work we have to do. And we look forward, as broadband stakeholders and fellow broadband geeks in this room, we look forward to continuing to work with you as we continue to update the data set and refine the important work of data. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Anne. Now I want to introduce our moderator, Rahul Gatande. He's the deputy editor of BroadbandBreakfast.com. Rahul has been writing for BroadbandBreakfast.com since the fall of 2009, and in May 2010 he became deputy editor. He was a fellow at George Mason University's Long-Term Governance Project, a researcher at the International Center for Applied Studies in Information Technology, and worked at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Please join me in welcoming Rahul.
Well, good morning, everyone. We're here to discuss, I think, a very timely topic with the updates coming up soon, as Anne said. So I'm going to quickly introduce the panel and then go right into the discussion. First, we have Adam Elliott, president and founder of ID Insight, which is an innovative data and analytics company serving over 600 banking institutions, e-commerce providers, and many of the largest broadband providers in the country. Next to him, we have Nicole Turner Lee of the Joint Center. She is the director of the Media and Technology Institute. Next to her, we have Bill Johnson. He's deputy director of the New York State Office of Cybersecurity, where he serves as the state's executive overseeing statewide GIS coordination activities. Next to him, we have Carrie Hinton. Carrie is policy advisor to Chairman Betty Ann Kane of the DC Public Service Commission. Carrie manages the broadband data service collection for DC and works with the Commission's Office of Technical and Regulatory Analysis. Next to Carrie, last but certainly not least, we have David Don. He's the Senior Director of Public Policy at Comcast, and he also serves as the Senior Director of Spectrum Policy over there. So first off, I'd like to ask each of the panelists, kind of going down the row, tell us a little bit about your organization and how you work with the mapping data.
Yeah, thanks, Rahul. Our company basically, I'm sorry, usually I speak pretty loud when I get going. Our company kind of got into this a couple years ago when all the stimulus grant monies came out, and there was this acknowledgement that there was a lack of data. So we came at it kind of from, I guess, from one way from a crowdsourcing aspect, but basically realized that we could go right to the internet to look at transactions, and we could see, you know, if you ordered from Amazon.com and you said, I live at 123 Main Street, you know, Amazon's going to see first, you know, right away that you're a Verizon or a Comcast customer. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that. But basically, how we got involved was to help for those underserved areas. Obviously, with the National Broadband Map, now we've been working with some of the states, really on that verification step to really cover off and make sure, identify carriers that may not exist. So obviously, as Ann alluded to, tremendous effort been going on. You know, we're using it in many, many ways, and now we're able to look at it and start to look and really quite honestly challenge and say, what are we missing? Because we know we need to keep moving the ball forward, even though we've made unbelievable progress to this point.
Good morning, everybody. Okay, I think I'm going to break the mic here. Okay. Nicole Turner from the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. And just for those that are unfamiliar with us, we're the only think tank here in Washington, D.C. that addresses issues related to African Americans and other people of color. And the Media and Technology Institute is particularly interested in issues related to digital access and adoption among communities of color. So we were one of the fortunate people to have access to the data set before it actually released. We were one of 5 research organizations that essentially had our ability to put our feet in the data, figure out what was wrong with the data, what was not working, what was well, and then work and beat up NTIA to figure out ways to fix it so that we could actually generate some good policy discussion. And our particular question in the data, so how we interacted with the map, is we were extremely interested if there was a correlation between broadband availability, race, and income, and how that fared when you looked at location, urban versus rural. And so we spent a lot of time overlaying the data, as Ann mentioned, with census tract data, and one of our researchers is right here in the audience as well that worked on that. And we worked with Ohio State University's Race and Ethnicity Center to really see if there was a correlation and a connection there. I'll rush into the findings. I know you have questions, but what we found to be very interesting, and I think Ann already addressed some of the data that we desired as researchers in terms of cost, and she also expressed some of the areas where NTIA, I think, did a better job of scrubbing and cleansing the data so that we can work with it. But what we found to be very interesting, and I'll kind of put this out as a soundbite and hopefully we'll talk about in discussion, is there were high rates of broadband deployment throughout the country. We particularly looked at Chicago, Los Angeles, and the state of South Carolina as a case studies. And so we saw that there was available broadband, but where we saw this disconnect was on adoption. And so part of our conversation from the consumer side is if there was access available, particularly high rates of wireline access, why weren't we seeing higher rates of broadband adoption? And I think that's where cost data would have been helpful to us as researchers to clearly understand what that picture is. What we also saw was that there's still work to be done on ubiquitous mobile access, particularly in communities of color where people are heavily dependent, as the research suggests, on mobile access use. So we would have liked to have seen, I think in all of our case studies, there was not 100% coverage. There was patched together coverage of wireless providers. We would have liked to see that variable cleaned up a little bit more to really make the argument that for communities of color that are heavily dependent on mobile access, that they were getting fair coverage and fair chance to actually use it. The other thing that we found interesting, and I'll just share one more point that I wanted to bring up, the maps are really interesting and critical because they give a snapshot of today. We were particularly interested in what does the snapshot of tomorrow look like. So in one of the case studies that I'll bring up that I found to be very interesting, and our researchers, we sort of pondered how to discuss this, even though we did not see a direct correlation between race and broadband build-out, so there was no linkage. We didn't see any broadband redlining, which we were happy to report, right? One of the things that we did start seeing, though, was some speed disparities. And for some, the speed disparity that we saw in the case of Los Angeles Metro and Inglewood, California, wasn't as great to many of us. There was still, reasonable download and upload speeds. But looking forward, we were concerned, will these communities be able to get access quickly to the internet to take advantage of the robust content that we actually see coming out in the next few years? So I think, in our work, we see this as an evolving process, and we intend to keep going further. We have a couple other projects in the queue to actually overlay, to look more into the cost data and see if we can find some cost data. We're also looking into more of the speed disparities, and we're particularly interested in looking at other applications of broadband services like health IT and seeing in communities of color and low-income communities if they're going to have the broadband infrastructure to even run some of these verticals that we're actually interested in exploring down the line. So I'll stop there, but it was a very complex, so Ann said she's a broadband geek. We became even geekier trying to dismantle the variables of the map. It was very useful for the research community to sort of give a picture of what was actually happening in the ecosystem.
Bill, you're kind of on the other side. You're actually pulling together this data.
Right. Morning. I'm Bill Johnson, state of New York, and I'm a mapping geek, and it's a good time to be a mapping geek actually as well. So the way the mapping program works is that the NTIA made a grant to each state and territory, 56 of us in total. And so it's a very interesting strategy. The NTIA could have chosen to work directly with the providers and collect the data nationally. Instead, they chose to delegate that work to the states. And I think that's been a very interesting and rewarding strategy because it has created a three-way partnership. The states need to partner with all of the providers that operate in their state to gather the data. And they do it voluntarily. So for me as a mapping manager of this program, every day I have to ask, am I doing the right thing to keep that voluntary participation going? And then we have the partnership with the NTIA folks, and Ann and Andrew McRae here as well have been fantastic to work with, just an outstanding team here, a small team, but of outstanding quality. And I've been doing mapping work for 26 years, and I can tell you that I have never seen an effort reap a seamless, nationwide, comprehensive coverage done to a common standard so quickly. It's really breathtaking when you think about there has never been a broadband map before, so we're going in uncharted territory and figuring out, and that's what partly makes this exciting for a mapping geek like me, is that figuring this all out. What's the right way to do it? Looking at some of these Web 2.0 things, crowdsourcing, and bringing in other independent data to verify what we're getting from the providers and making that all work. Very, very exciting. So I'll have lots more to comment on, but I probably, in the interest of keeping this introduction short, I'll stop there.
Good morning. My name is Carrie Hinton. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm policy advisor to Chairman Betty Ann Kane. Thus, I am here speaking on behalf of Chairman Kane, who unfortunately is not able to join us today. Some of you have probably met her at some of the past broadband breakfasts, but due to the, shall we say, the multidiscipline nature of the Public Service Commission, she is, as we speak, conducting a webinar on smart grid deployment over at the U.S. Telecom and, as they call themselves, Broadband Association. So at any given moment, I may be working on broadband mapping issues, or hopefully not today, but on occasion, Pepco outages. But anyway, just by way of background, DC is, in its mapping activities, have been somewhat different than most of the other states, and that's not just because our geography or our political status is different, but because we actually initiated a lot of our data collection prior to receipt of the NTIA grant, which we're very happy to have received. Thank you, Ann. Thank you, Andrew. But we began collecting data initially from CLECs, which we do regulate, and as most of you know, public service commissions don't regulate broadband service providers, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. But we began collecting data from broadband service providers primarily through CLECs and the ILECs. Those of you who don't know the acronym, CLECs is Competitive Local Exchange Carriers, and the ILEC, of course, is Verizon. So we began collecting, well, we are a small jurisdiction. If I was in Maryland, I'd be able to say, we have two ILECs. We have Verizon and Armstrong, whereas in California, they have dozens of ILECs. So our geography is different, and thus the lineup of characters is different too. But the point that I was getting at is that we began collecting broadband data primarily through requests initially from the FCC for access to what's known as the Form 477 data. As many of you probably know, all broadband service providers, all ILECs, all wireless carriers, all satellite service providers, and now all VoIP service providers are required semi-annually to report a variety of different types of data metrics through what's known as a Form 477, which is now an online filing process for those companies. And that's collected semi-annually, and at the time that we began collecting broadband data was viewed as the single best source for broadband data. The problem is that as it is now, is that the FCC wouldn't release that data except on an aggregated basis, and usually a year to year and a half after it had already been collected, which from our viewpoint, from a policy perspective, was grossly inadequate. Thus, we began asking on a voluntary basis our CLECs and Verizon to voluntarily give us a copy of the Form 477 that they gave to the FCC. Now, since we've received the NTIA grant, we've continued that process. Every time we send out our questionnaire requesting the type of data that NTIA would like, we request a copy of the Form 477. Now, you might ask why we do that. Two reasons we do that. One is for verification purposes. It provides us the capability to cross-check for an individual company the data that they've given us in a questionnaire in comparison to the data that they've given the FCC. But secondly, and from our perspective, more importantly, it gives us access to adoption data. As Ann has mentioned, the NTIA National Broadband Map is really focused on where broadband service is available. It's availability. Well, for our jurisdiction, availability is probably plainly obvious, is not a big issue. Unless you're in Rock Creek Park or a variety of other particularly parks that are in the city, you're able to obtain wireline and usually wireless broadband service. Now, DC government has supplemented the commercial services that are available with our own free Wi-Fi services. And so many of those are located in parks, I would point out. So we have virtually 100% availability of broadband services, either on a wireline, wireless, or both basis. But the issue has been adoption. And that's been a policy issue that my boss, Chairman Kane, has been championing in a variety of forums. That we have very low adoption rates, not surprisingly, in parts of our city. One of the points let me make is that we've been collecting data not only for input to the NTIA and the National Broadband Map, but we've also created our own broadband map, as have the other states. I think virtually all of them now are up online. They have their own websites with their own broadband maps. Ours, give a plug here, is broadbandmap.dc.gov. And if you go to our map, just by comparison to what you can find for DC in the National Broadband Map versus what we have, not only, of course, is the availability data shown, not only is the number of providers, who the providers are, what the speeds are of the services that they're providing, but we provide data also on a census block basis, but we provide adoption data. And we currently have on our broadband map what the adoption rate has been in each census block for 2008, 2009, and currently we're updating it with 2010 data. That also shows the DC government wireless hotspots that I mentioned, and of course we also show where our community anchor centers, which are primarily libraries, where they're located in the city. So there's features that we've been able to add that we think are beneficial to our residents, to commercial businesses that aren't necessarily available on the NTI map. And that's really one of the pluses of the grant, is it's given us that flexibility to be able to address what we think our concerns are. I don't want to belabor the conversation here, but I think a real important point, though, to talk about perhaps amongst the panelists is the nexus between the National Broadband Map, the functions of NTIA, and what the FCC is doing relative to broadband data collection. Thank you very much for your attention.
Rahul, hi. David Don from Comcast, and those were excellent remarks. Let me just say that Comcast has long been a supporter of this effort to create a national broadband map. And the reason is we think there's a very good story to tell about broadband in the U.S. that hasn't been told particularly well, and I think you see it crystallized on this panel today. Broadband availability, while not perfect, of course, it's widely accepted now that the United States has broadband available to over 90, 92, 93% of the nation. And we have to figure out a way to get that gap, and there are some programs, some public policy issues we're going to work through to bridge that gap and get as close to 100% as we can as a nation. And the mapping effort hopefully will help us target our efforts to get there. But really, as Comcast has been saying for a couple of years now, and you heard it crystallized in Ann's remarks and in Carrie's remarks just now, in the U.S., our broadband issues are not about availability, but about adoption. Roughly 67, 68% of Americans have adopted broadband, while 93, 94% have it available to them. And we as a nation, now that we've invested these resources on availability, can focus our energies on adoption. Now that we've, as Ann was saying, the importance of collecting data to identify the challenges and then focus our efforts on dealing with them. So we've always thought there's a great broadband story to be told in America. The map shows that there's, in the U.S., competition. There's robust availability. Among the cable providers, you see that, for example, Comcast has deployed our DOCSIS 3.0 technology to roughly 90% of the homes we pass, or 40 million American homes, maybe about a third of all homes, have access. Some of the fastest broadband available anywhere in the world. We offer a variety of services beginning at 1 megabit per second all the way up to 100 megabits per second. So we think this mapping effort has been a terrific effort to focus attention where it needs to be focused, to see where our challenges lie, and to make sure going forward we know where to invest our resources. Let me just say that we, one party in all of these discussions, I think Bill mentioned it briefly, but look, ISPs have been a significant part of this process. Bill mentioned the partnership with the ISPs, but let me say, Comcast alone has probably devoted over 400 hours of staff and vendor resources to produce this mapping data. I mean, everything you see starts with an inquiry to the ISPs. Carrie gives us a call, Bill gives us a call, and says it's that time of year, it's 6 months has passed, let's do it again. Now, we've been working very closely with NTIA. We were one of only 3 companies that signed a letter to NTIA committing to join them in the process. We helped refine some of the requests. It was, we have to figure out how to manage some of the burdens here. We don't have anyone on staff. Comcast doesn't have positions just to hire people to provide data to the federal government, so we're diverting existing resources. But we've put a tremendous amount of resources in helping all of the states and the district meet their obligations to the federal government. So sometimes that gets lost in the process, and I appreciate Bill especially highlighting the partnership role there, because it is voluntary on our part. We don't get any of the money that has gone to the states, the millions of dollars that have gone to the states. We devote our own resources to it, and it turns out we don't actually have all of this data. I'm responsible for this in our company, so I can tell you. We don't just have this data in a file somewhere. We don't collect it by census blocks. We don't update it in the way that the federal government would like us to update, or the states, to maintain a uniform process. We agree that the uniformity has been terrific, and sort of you see the federalism system really work terrifically here with some federal standards, and then the states having some flexibility in how and when, but within the parameters established by NTA. We think that process has worked terrifically well. But it is a burden on us. We've committed a lot of research to it, and hopefully we've all learned a lot from this process. So thank you for having me today.
Great, thanks. My first question is, I guess, for Bill. Carrie talked a little bit about how DC is keeping legacy data up to show researchers like Nicole, well, in 2008 there was this, then in 2009 we had this. What is New York doing? I mean, you guys have a lot more data just because of, space, I guess. What's New York's plan?
Well, at the moment, our broadband map, and I'll give you a plug, it's broadbandmap.ny.gov.
Oh, good.
I invite you to look at that. Our broadband map currently, it displays the current data. We have not configured our site to have rollbacks to the prior deliveries, although that's certainly something we could probably readily choose to do. One of the things, in fact, I was just talking to Andrew as we started here about this. The states have all pretty much stood up some sort of an internet broadband map. And it's interesting that the program didn't set down specific requirements for what the state needed to do with a broadband map. We simply had to stand one up. And that gave us a lot of flexibility. And what we are doing now is we are doing some things differently than on the national broadband map. In some cases, responsive to things that providers have brought to our attention. For example, we have a number of providers in our state who, what they report to us to meet the requirements for the grant is their maximum advertised speed at the census geography level. We've had some of them say to us, well, yeah, we have, we can give you that maximum number, but we actually package our offerings at several different discrete speeds. Would you be willing to show that on the map so that you can see that company X has a package that's at 3 megabits a second and another at 10 and another at 25? And we said, you know what? Why not? There's no reason for us not to go ahead and do that. We'll still provide the data to the NTIA in the way they need it for the national broadband map, but we can enhance the way we display it to serve the state better. So that's just an example of the kinds of things we're doing there.
And Carrie, what's changed between that initial mapping and kind of the updates and, reference, they got a second set of data in February, and that's going to go up live, I guess, at the end of the week or so, and then another set's going to go up in October. What'd you learn? August. What have you learned in that kind of in-between process from working with ISPs now?
I was actually remiss in my initial comments. I'm glad that you asked me this question because it gives me an opportunity to recover, and that is to not only offer thanks to Comcast and to Verizon, who I know is represented here, but to any of the other broadband service providers that are here, because as has been mentioned, this has been a voluntary undertaking. We have no regulatory authority to require Comcast or even Verizon to give us any data. And certainly there's a number of companies that are not, as I mentioned previously, are not subject to our jurisdiction that have cooperated and given us data. And that's really been part of the challenge that we've had to deal with. And we've had a little bit of advantage over some of the other states because we do have a little bit of leverage over some companies, not to say that we've made any implicit or explicit comments of that nature, but we have had a little leverage over companies that are subject to our jurisdiction to, shall we say, obtain some cooperation in their provision of data to us. But there's a number of companies that aren't subject to our jurisdiction, as I mentioned. And one of the major differences, though, that we've found from our initial undertaking of requesting, initially we asked simply for a copy of the Form 477, to now our standard practice is we ask for a copy of the Form 477, as well as we have this questionnaire. Please fill that out. We'll be back in touch with you if we have any questions or don't understand it. And what we found is that there has been an increase of cooperation amongst companies in providing us the data. Now, let me give you just a little snapshot, if I can take a moment here, as to what we have addressed in the way of collecting data. And again, we're the District of Columbia. We're 65 square miles. So we're not New York. We're not California. So if you can just kind of keep in mind that we're extremely small in comparison to what's been going on nationally. But when we began our data collection activities, we were querying over 200 companies that we knew operated in the District of Columbia or in the Washington metropolitan area, which is one of the initial problems. Is some companies advertise providing service in the Washington metro area, but they're really only operating in Maryland or in Northern Virginia and not actually in the District of Columbia. Some might say that's, shall we say, deceptive advertising, but that, as some people might say, that's not my job. But so we've gone from 200. Now we've whittled that down to the last data round. We asked approximately 150 companies as to whether they were providing broadband service. Of that 150 companies, we have confirmed that there were 40 companies that actually did provide broadband service in the District of Columbia. And of those 40 companies, all but 3 of them provided us a copy of the Form 477 or the data from the Form 477 in another format, as well as a response to our questionnaire. And I might point out, of those 3 companies, 2 of the 3 had actually responded in the last round of data, and for still unclear reasons, those 2 companies did not respond to the latest round. And that's really been, I think, a major change from when we first started to where we are now, is that companies are understanding that yes, this is going to happen twice a year, and secondly, we think that now that they've seen the National Broadband Map, and now that they've seen our map, and perhaps have seen New York's map and California's map and so on, they're starting to see that these are tools that policymakers are using. They're seeing that these are tools that are available to them as a business and that they can utilize as a data source. And having worked in the private sector myself for 20 years, it's very difficult to obtain data that you can make competitive market decisions on without it costing a lot of money. And here's a way in which they can obtain information from a public, a reliable, vetted public source that they can utilize to make some market decisions. I'll just stop it there. Thank you.
That brings a good point, David. You mentioned, Comcast isn't really in the business of making maps. I mean, they are for their own customers, and I'm sure you've got it in your advertising. Are you using this data to see, oh, look, Verizon's there. We didn't know Verizon was there, and, it looks like Quest has a thing there. How are you using it internally, I guess, for marketing, for competitiveness, or, what are you using it for?
In all honesty, for business purposes, I think we're more of a producer of information than consumer of the information at the moment. As Carrie mentioned, it is expensive, but we have resources to purchase a lot of competitive data in the marketplace. I have a feeling a lot of what we're probably spending a lot of money for is going to be inputted or taking data that's inputted from these broadband maps. So someone else is going to retake this data, make it look a little different, and upsell it to us for a lot more money, which I have a feeling that's how it works in corporate. I've experienced that in corporate areas, so I think that's where we are. One of the challenges with using this for truly competitive entry is that it's the timing issue, right? There's just inherent that we have multiple areas between us collecting it, sending it to the states processing it, sending it to the national level processing. The data is inherently a little bit stale for competitive entry business planning purposes. For public policy purposes, the state of broadband doesn't change overnight. I mean, it's slowly moving. But for true competitive understanding where Fios may be making its next maneuver, a year later or 8, 9, 10 months later, we're in trouble if we didn't know they were coming there by then. So I think it has a slightly limited value to us for pure business competitive entry. But I think they're probably, when we do some general analyses of the marketplace, I know folks in our strategic teams are looking at this, but I don't think we're using it necessarily for marketing and competition assessment.
That's interesting. Adam, you're kind of, I guess, one of the companies that will be upselling data to Don. So to David, so what, how are you using this older, 6 months old data with kind of the stuff you can pull in weekly?
It's a great question. I think that's not our focus on this piece. I mean, with the National Broadband Map, we look at it as we need to have it. And with where we're at, to me, it's all about now going forward. So, back to David's comment about the things we need to look at. We need to look at availability. We need to look at adoption. And the one that we're, and also personally looking at is just not just adoption, which is obviously very important, but also that speed metric. And how do we move from, starting to think about, it's no longer about availability, but it's about 5, 10, 20, 50. And I on a personal basis, I look at it as, I used to have Comcast, sorry, David, but and we had about 5 meg, and I moved to 40 meg. And just without thinking about it, it was for me more of a pricing decision or a cost. But I look at that as what happened to my personal productivity as I went from 5 meg to 40. And it was huge. Things that took me a half a minute, took, 5 seconds. And you keep multiplying that over and over as you get into the public policy and what it means. And a long way of saying, when we are where we're at today, we've made phenomenal progress on the broadband map. And as we look forward, now it's especially as we look at it from where do we rank in the world, what are the changes? How much progress are we making and how fast? And we can do that at 6-month increments and say we've moved this far. We're getting to our goal, or no, we're not. And if we're not, why not? And how do we get there faster? So that's so right now we're looking at it as the 6-month increment. Yeah, it's a great snapshot in time. As David said, as you get into the very pertinent, like almost real-time decisions being made at Comcast, Verizon, yeah, you probably need to get a little more granular with some more of that design data that's specific to, Comcast, Verizon, and the meaningful metrics that they need.
Now, Nicole, you're actually using this data, and one of the, I guess, previous hardships for broadband researchers has always been, well, we want more broadband because it creates economic opportunity, and policymakers are like, well, prove it. And we've been like, well, we don't have the data yet, but if you build the broadband, are you finally able to prove it, or are we getting to that place where you soon can?
I think the map, and I think to all the panelists and the points that have been made, is actually providing researchers with visual depictions of where there are disconnects between broadband infrastructure and where we see higher rates of unemployment, lower achievement gaps, et cetera. When we looked at the state of South Carolina, for example, it was really interesting to look at a state where most of the facilities and assets were along the tourism corridors, and where there was limited access and no access was really out in the rural communities. And when we overlaid that with unemployment rates, we saw striking comparisons between high unemployment and low business development, and where there was lack of infrastructure. So I think the points that have been made about really looking forward, from a policy perspective, the map really revealed for us also, and I've mentioned it earlier, how the spectrum crunch is affecting communities of color, in our case, of what we looked at. But overall, we saw a lot of wireline build out, I think, too, that might also help solve some of the problems. I mean, one of the other policy areas that I think, and it was kind of mentioned, so I'm going to bring it back up, that this correlation between what the NTIA is doing, what the FCC is doing on National Broadband Map plan. So we'd like to see as researchers to actually get less anecdotal and much more evidence-based as to the effectiveness of these resources, some matching between these efforts, because I think that's going to help us move the needle on what we're discovering in these visual depictions and this data analysis, and what activities need to be matched with that, and investments, I think David said, need to be made to actually ensure that we're seeing a longitudinal curve upward as opposed to backwards. So, for researchers, this has been a great opportunity to really start to put some real hard facts out there. But, I want to put out there are still problems with the data that have to be worked through because, again, it's a voluntary process. And so we can take that snapshot for what it's worth. It's truly not empirical to a certain extent, but it gives us some leeway to talk about, some of the trends that we've seen in our research around broadband adoption disparities.
Could I follow up on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Nicole used the example from the state of South Carolina. When we started looking at the broadband policy issues in D.C. several years ago, Chairman Keene and I, when we would talk with other elected officials and other administration officials in the D.C. government, it was always kind of it should be obvious that broadband service is available and is adopted in greater amounts in the wealthier, shall we say, the wealthier sections of the city in comparison to the lower income portions of the city. But we really had no factual evidence that, in fact, was the case until we had the opportunity to start collecting this data. And now if you go to our website, you'll be able to see the evidence that when you go to Northwest D.C., we have 100% virtually adoption of broadband service. Whereas if you go to Southeast D.C., across the Anacostia River, and what areas are designated as Wards 8 and Ward 7, which are the lower income, primarily lower income areas in the city, and we have an adoption rate of about 40%. So there is a significant gulf or divide, shall we say, within our city. That allows us as policy advocates, the chairman and I, to be able to go to the FCC and to be able to advocate for the adoption, not to overuse that term, but the implementation of a broadband adoption lifeline program. And we've been doing that now for several years, and hopefully the FCC is getting closer to moving and at least implementing something on a pilot basis. But without the factual data, it's difficult for a policy advocate to be able to justify the expensive resources, whether it be, frankly, our dollars at the D.C. government level or the federal government dollars, to be able to utilize for a program that we think is vitally needed in our city and is probably needed nationally as well. Thank you.
I have a question for Bill. At some point, the NTIA money is going to run out. Congress said you've got X amount of time, X amount of money, and presuming that the budget crunch won't allow the federal government to, dole out any more cash to the states. Does New York have any plans to keep this going beyond the kind of budgetary money that they have set up, or?
That's a very challenging question. The grant funds run through October of 2014 for us.
Yeah. And
that's almost 3.5 years from now. Frankly, my crystal ball's in the shop. It's broken again. And we have, like every state, we have pretty severe fiscal challenges right now. And I can't speculate on, what our state of economic well-being will be 3.5 years out from now, and whether there will be the wherewithal for the state to continue to fund this on our own. I'm unable to respond to that.
Are legislators within the state seeing the value of the internal map? Are they using it for kind of infrastructure funding or anything like that, or is it still kind of a little too new to?
No, let me back up a little bit. Our governor established a state broadband development and deployment council, and that council meets 4 times a year. And I've made mapping presentations pretty much at every one of those council meetings. They've been very well received. It's pretty much the factual footprint for the policymakers to contemplate which direction to go with things. I'm not a policy wonk. I'm a mapping guy. I see my job as to get the facts down and to document what the factual situation is and to publish that information openly so that the policymakers have good information to go forward with. And for example, we've recently conducted a broadband adoption study in New York. Ann mentioned that. We actually contracted with the university. They have an applied research arm, and they conducted a telephone survey to over 3,000 residents in New York, looking at what are the reasons why you might be resisting the use of broadband technology when it's available to you. That report's been published. One of the things our council has asked us to do is to map that. So we're going to be correlating the variables that are indicated as indicators of relation to broadband adoption, finding those same variables in census data and estimating at the census block level across the state what we predict the adoption rates are. And it'll be very interesting. I'm looking forward to getting that work done. We'll be able to see now how availability and competition and some of these other things relate to what the actual adoption rates are across our state.
Are you collecting cost data with that? Because I know that can kind of be an adoption issue.
We are not at this point collecting cost data. It's something the NTIA has suggested to us as a leading practice that was recommended in the supplemental grant funding. I'm one of the states that, in responding to that in our grant proposal, expressed a lot of reticence about doing that. Frankly, I'm softening a bit in that because as a consumer, the 2 things I care about for broadband are how fast and how much.
Right.
I don't care what color the wire is or whether it's wireless or any of those things. I just want to know how much and how fast. So I think there is an interest in gathering that. We haven't yet really gotten serious about how to do it or how we'll map it or any of those things yet. But I think going forward, it's something we're going to have to take a more serious look at.
All right. I guess one of the final questions I have for the panel as a whole is, how would you grade the NTIA map? I mean, we know it's a first effort. We know they're working on it. But, if you had to give it a grade, and what are its strengths and what are its weaknesses? Why don't we start the other way? We'll start at the end.
Sure. So let me begin. I think this discussion makes clear how valuable the map is. Having good data allows us to focus on where the problems are and where they're not. And this discussion makes clear that the problem we have or the challenges we have in this country are around broadband adoption. We've spent very little time talking about availability, whether or not it's 90, 91, 92, right? I mean, this panel all agrees. We have we have regulators here who are really and providers and other folks who are saying what we have in this country is we need to better understand what are the barriers to adoption, whether it's pricing. Some of these issues we're talking about in geography have to do with computers in the home, education. There are all kinds of factors. But having good data allows us to have an honest discussion about these challenges. And I think, if for no other reason, you have to give the mapping effort an A for bringing us this clear picture, I think, of where U.S. broadband success and challenges lie. Let me bring up touch on one other issue which was raised, which was broadband speeds, and Ann brought it up in her presentation. One of the things that you have to be careful about when you do this kind of an effort, though, and we're the federal government or the state government, is that you give data sort of imprimatur of absolute correctness. So if it's the federal government says this is it, then this is it. There's not a lot you can debate about it. And one of the concerns we had with the map was the use of some of the speed test data from the FCC website, which the FCC has admitted since it has limited value and has limited accuracy. And while there might be qualifications in your presentation, Ann, and footnotes on the map, those get lost. When the federal government issues a map that says this is the speed that you get at this location, you might get at this location, people assume that to be an absolute. So there has to be some kind of a balancing here between wanting to get information out to consumers and to citizens and information they've paid for, hundreds of millions of dollars for, but making sure that it's absolutely accurate. And one of the things on the first round of the map, clearly there were some areas that need improvement, and we have all the confidence that the second round is going to be tremendously better, and then every iteration after that's going to take us to as close to 100% accuracy as you possibly could get. And what I'm hopeful for is this next round will get as much attention as the first round, because by the way, some of the errors are the ISP fault too, right? In the data collection we submitted. So the next round we're correcting those errors as well. But there has to be, I think, a sensitivity that when it comes with the federal government or a government stamp of approval, the citizenry takes it as the right answer, and it's hard to qualify. Footnotes don't get read. So somewhere around there we need to convey the message that either it's not absolute or that maybe we don't publish information that we aren't 100% accurately sure about. And finally, on the speed question about data, I will point folks to the FCC. The CIO wrote at the FCC wrote a blog post a few weeks ago. They have been undertaking some broadband performance measurements around the country. Comcast has been very active in the FCC effort, along with some of the other ISPs in the community, most of the other ISPs in the nation. And we're looking forward to seeing some really improved measurement data of broadband performance in the U.S. I think people who did some of these online speed tests, which have limitations, are going to be pleasantly surprised about how well the U.S. is performing. And again, as I started off my talk, we think there's a very good story to tell about broadband in the United States, whether it's about availability with this map or about performance. And we think that data is going to come out soon from the FCC. And then we can maybe focus a lot of the discourse on what the real challenges are, where I agree wholly with the panelists here that it's around broadband adoption.
Let me start off just by stepping back and looking at a little bit of the history of how we came to this point with the National Broadband Map. And what I want to emphasize is that both NTIA and the states, including the District of Columbia, none of us were doing broadband mapping 5 years ago. There were advocates that we needed to do broadband mapping. There were advocates for a national broadband map. And I might offer kudos to broadbandcensus.com and Drew Clark, I guess now you're, founder and former leader, which were great advocates about the need for a national broadband plan and a national broadband map, and how that eventually morphed into the states, including the District of Columbia, being able to develop our own maps and our own websites and so on. But there weren't staff that were just waiting for the bell to ring for us to start collecting the data. NTIA had nobody on their staff to run this grant program. They had nobody on their staff that did data collection and did website and broadband map development or any of that. So they started from scratch. As soon as they got the money, they had to hit the ground running, even though they didn't have the staff to do it. So I really offer a lot of kudos, particularly to Ann's leadership at NTIA and the support of Larry Strickling, her boss's boss, I guess, and the work that they have done to be able to produce this map. There were many people in the policy community that doubted the ability of the NTIA, particularly relying on 50-plus states, including the District of Columbia, to give them enough data to even produce a national broadband map, much less the one that they did produce on time with the quality and the detail and the coverage that it did have. Certainly there aren't all the bells and whistles there that some people would like to have seen and perhaps maybe added along the way. And obviously there are problems not only in the rural areas of the country, but even here in D.C., where some of the data was a little squishy. Without naming names, but for example, the ILAC that operates in the District of Columbia, through the data that we received from them, we saw, wait a minute, there's a census block here that shows they have no customers. We know that's not Rock Creek Park. But you go back to those companies and you try to work with them, and sometimes that didn't get done in time for the production of the first map. Thus, there were opportunities for, shall we say, those critics that were out there were looking for an opportunity to say, hey, look at this state. We know that there's a broadband service provider there, and it's not shown up on the map. That could have occurred because of a variety of reasons, but the point is we're all learning from that exercise, and we're going forward, and the map will be better the next time you see it and the next time after that you see it. Let me just close with one final point that I want to make sure I have an opportunity to be able to address, and that is the importance of the map to the FCC. Those of you that had the opportunity to read the National Broadband Plan that was issued by the FCC, those of you like myself that have had the unfortunate experience of reading through the various notices of proposed rulemaking from the FCC regarding universal service reform, know that it's critical that the FCC uses this data in the future of the Universal Service Fund, how they deploy the money to be able to build out broadband services, how they utilize the data from their Form 477s and hopefully from the states in designing an adoption program as we go forward. Thus, it's critical that we continue this effort, refine this effort, so that we conduct these programs, the Universal Service Fund for high-cost areas, broadband service deployment through the Universal Service Fund, broadband adoption through the Universal Service Fund, that we conduct those programs in a manner that's most efficient and effective.
A minus. No, let me expand on that a little bit. You asked for grade the map. Yeah. I think it's a phenomenal achievement that we created a comprehensive, factual-based broadband map, seamless across the country in a year. And it's interesting, and I think it's rather telling, that the discussion this morning hasn't been about the map is wrong. The discussion's been about where do we go from here, and looking at adoption and looking at the policy issues and the sustainability and all those other social justice things related to broadband. So I think we're already kind of past the debate about whether the map is any good, and we kind of accept it as a given that we finally have that factual basis for making decisions. I think that's really phenomenal. There's a couple of things that, as one of the mapping geeks on the inside of this thing, that I think we can be making improvements on, and the team at NTIA is aware of these things and are very proactive about discussing with us and working with us to make those things better. I'll just give you one example. There's an underlying assumption when we're mapping things at the census block level that if availability is reported at one address in the block, that service is available at all the other addresses in the block. And that assumption's probably fine in an urban footprint when you're looking at city blocks and so forth, where the houses are close together and all that. What we're seeing is when we get out into the suburbs and the exurbs, where the infrastructure is at the clusters of homes where they're close together, and the rest of the block perhaps does not have broadband availability. And when we talk about on our map, we crowdsource. So when you visit our map and the NTIA map, you can respond and tell us if the map is right at a given address. And we get a lot of feedback from the public this way. And in the vast majority of cases that we're getting crowdsourcing information, they're telling us that a block that we tell them is served by Company X, when they can't, Company X doesn't get to their house. It maybe gets elsewhere in the block, but doesn't get to them. So we know that there is a bias in overestimating the availability. How much that bias is something I'm working to try to estimate. And Andrew and Ann have encouraged us to work with the other grantees, set up a little work group, do some R&D, and try to come up with a way to estimate what that buy is. I don't think it's very severe. I think it's probably in the single digits of percentage. But it's something that I'm interested in being able to provide better information to consumers of the map, so that we don't have folks go into the map and assuming it's wrong because they have evidence of a specific address that's indicated incorrectly on the map. So other than some of those subtleties, that's why I gave it an A-. We're getting there, but you always want to leave room for improvement, right? So giving ourselves a little margin.
Nicole?
So I would say, and so I won't start with the grade first, but I'll start with just, I think, commentary on what we've heard so far, and then I'll go right to the grade.
Great.
I think this has been a critical discussion this morning because broadband is obviously becoming much more important to the livelihood of this nation, around our economic competitiveness, our social competitiveness, et cetera. And I think the infrastructure question is one piece of the entire story and narrative that we actually have to tell about how we're actually going to create higher rates of subscription and utilization around broadband. So with that, and as a researcher, I give it a B, primarily because I think it's one part of the equation. It's a baseline data that has been collected that gives us a really great snapshot into what we look like now, and one that at least allows us to stop comparing ourselves to the international community and look closely at our domestic situation as where we're seeing infrastructure deployed. But with that, as a researcher also, I want to say, and a policy person, having the data is not enough if we don't have the application.
Right.
And so I think, what is always interesting to me in these discussions as we're in this broadband, the energy of broadband enthusiasm around broadband is high. We really have to look at the other things that are going on in this community that I think will help enhance the baseline data, whether that's the BTOP programs that are currently being funded that will tell us a little bit more around utilization and adoption, whether it's the investments being made by the private sector. We've got several announcements. I know Comcast is one where we're trying to take pilots and really see, is cost an issue? Is it related to certain segments of population where we'll see higher rates of adoption? Or it's meaningful use by the cities and states, which I think, as we see more of those, because I don't think all the states are actually doing this uniformly, where they're actually taking this data and running with it. If we have more of that uniform application of the data to inform consumers as well as state and local legislators, I think we'll see much more impact. So I'm confident that we're going to get there. As at the Joint Center, we are really, really concerned that the digital divide will grow, particularly, not necessarily around access, but around the utilization side, and whether or not content that is currently driving the marketplace is going to be available to them in a way that they can access. I think that goes back to your speed question. But I think going forward, it's a great place to start. And we're really excited around, working with the private sector, working with states, and really and other think tanks to figure out, what is the issue and how do we increase that utilization factor so that we're not having this same conversation with all this evidence later because we've not really been able to bring all the data together. That's kind of how I learned when I was getting my PhD. You got to bring everything to the table. And you don't grade, and I wasn't an easy grader, Ann, so you didn't want to be in my class. But you start with some baseline, but you've got to overlay these other factors, which is I think what we've heard here, to figure out how we as a nation come up with a quality output that drives the total agenda and not just one piece of it.
Adam, I guess you get the last word on this.
I guess I'll jump in. I was a pretty tough grader too, but I would give I was asked to grade the NTIA, and I would give them an A, absolutely. When you think of all the progress that was made in a short time, and you think, Ann talked about $40 million. If you look at all the work that was done for that, I mean, it's quite astonishing, quite honestly. At the same time, I would give some of the states B's and C's. Some of the carriers obviously would get some F's. But as far as the NTA, I think the progress that has been made is tremendous. The one thing I'd like to close with is that, I'm kind of, the thing we talked about it, Bill, you mentioned looking forward. We've got a lot of challenges in front of it. It's not just 2014 and the budget, the current funding. We also have this engagement with the carriers. The one thing, just from the outside looking in, what I saw through this whole first round process was the relationships that were developed at many, many levels. And kind of going back to what Ann mentioned, in the room are broadband geeks. There's a lot of newbie broadband geeks that we've created. And I think we really need to focus on that from a relationship setting. Obviously, it would be horrible if Comcast or Verizon or whoever fell out for whatever reason. Not that we couldn't help, fill in some of those holes, but I think we have that challenge to keep that carrier engagement in process. And really, I look at it as between now and 2014 or whatever, this is the time. Making decisions and policy decisions out of the data. Because the more that we can prove, the more that we can show, the more that we can measure over these next 2 and 3 years, that's the evidence we need. I think, we know in the room we have to have a national broadband map. And there's a growing community outside this, and we need to keep widening that circle. So, when it gets into 2014, whatever it looks like at the time, there will be an acknowledgement that we can't turn back. This is too important. We need roads, we need broadband, and we got to drive the ball forward.
Great, thanks. Now you've heard enough of me yammering at the panelists, so I'm going to allow all of you to ask questions. Any questions from the panel? I guess we have one in the back. Could you just move up a little bit for the camera? Thanks. You just identify yourself first.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Jay Hellman. I'm an overeducated real estate developer. And in 1980, 31 years ago, I started thinking about this. I was building downtown office buildings. My overeducation is in math and computer science, so I'm unusual for the real estate development field. But I could see the evolution of computer and communication technology, and I said, this is going to change the world. I got to think about it. And I spent a year and a half just answering or trying to answer 3 questions. How has the evolution of technology changed the nature of work, the physical character of buildings, and patterns of land use? So Nicole, in terms of what you were saying, you got to get all of the things on the table. Everything is interconnected with everything else. I came up with a theory that I termed virtual adjacency. The 3 most important things in real estate are location, location, and location. Well, what's location? It's physical adjacency. When you stand on a site, you look at what's around you. And if there's great stuff around you, it's a great location. And if there's junk around you, it's a bad location. Well, as the nature of work has become increasingly processing and communicating information, an increasing amount of our use of the transportation network is to perform that function, which really means the last mile of the broadband network is asphalt. And we're choking on transportation problems, and although the word telecommuting has been around for decades, the trouble is most people think they know what it is or what it isn't, but the term virtual adjacency is a much richer and more encompassing term, which suggests that with enough broadband and enough technology to use it, that the ability to do things as though you're there without needing to be physically there will increase. And what this means for poor and uneducated and rural areas is the ability to bring the best teachers in the world, but most important, and this has been my biggest frustration specifically, and I don't mean to pick on Comcast, but you grew up in the cable business, which was a one-way street. We provide, you receive. And I always felt that a real information network is symmetrical because every one of us is a content generator. So I'd love to have the panel comment a little bit on that.
Thanks. Adam, do you want to start? You were kind of mentioning the... Or, go ahead.
No, I was just going to mention part of the reason why we looked at the question was correlating with economic development. I was presenting at Broadband Properties not too long ago among legislators, and that issue is really coming up more so. The opportunity to look at traditional forms of economic and urban development where you had to bring in and look at place and space is no longer the paradigm that we actually have to work in when we're trying to redevelop communities. And if we don't want urban communities and rural communities to become e-brownfields where there's limited opportunity because they cannot connect with the regional marketplace or the global marketplace, we've got to bring broadband infrastructure to those communities. And that's why I said the map for us was very telling around baseline visual depiction of where there was access. And when we correlated that with huge social problems, achievement gaps, incarceration, unemployment, where there was limited access out or into those communities is where we saw higher rates of these social issues. So I think that's the next step of this conversation. How do you get the economic development people to actually tie that in? I know we've got several cities on this panel and states, but how do you really get them to start talking about broadband from that perspective as instead of the old traditional economic development models?
All right, I think one more quick question.
Thank you. My name is Steve Doiron. I'm from Hughes Network Systems. We're an ISP over in Germantown. We offer broadband by satellite. We're one of the RUS grantees. So if I can impose on two very close interconnected questions. The first one deals with the data going into the plan. So the money stops at the aggregators in terms of compiling all the data. So us, as Comcast, ourselves, we don't get any funding for the submission of the data. So if you look at me, I'm one guy. I get 56 questionnaires. If I've got one day to do it, you can just calculate how much time I have per questionnaire. The question I have is there anything that can be done to either have data submission, at least a minimum data set at the federal level, or have you guys thought of working together to simplify your questionnaire to a common one to make the life easier for us? And to me, it's garbage in, garbage out. If you get bad data, which you don't understand from us, that reflects in the output. The second question I have, which is interconnected, goes back to something Bill said. I understand what you said is we're providing data at the census tract level, but the federal government is going to be putting policy at an individual level. So how do we make sure that consumers, and I've seen a number as a RUS grantee, suffer from saying, no, I'm sorry, you're not eligible for that program because your census tract is covered, where in fact that particular person may not be receiving service. Thank you.
So, Anne actually wanted to...
I'll actually answer this one. I think this is just a really good, just the difference between the different types of technologies that we look at. And that's one of the reasons all of our grantees have been setting up working groups to talk about how best to validate and gather information on different types of technologies. I think satellite is unique in a lot of ways because if I asked you, what does satellite cover? You'd say it is the same across the U.S. except for 2 or 3% of the population that doesn't get satellite service. And so that's a very different kind of answer than if I asked Comcast or Verizon. I do want to make clear, and that was why I brought this, that there are sometimes some extra and additional questions that the state awardees ask, but everyone asks this. It is and that was sort of in terms of this kind of federalist, bifurcated model where we have a national standard and then we have every state, going out and asking it. And we actually had a great conversation internally with the Satellite Association about ways, given your different structure, how we can continue supporting the program as it's made up, but make sure that we're decreasing burden, just like we're thinking, we try to think about with all of the providers. And I do want to clarify one thing, which is the data is at census block, not census tract. And I make that because there's, I think it's 47,000 census blocks in the U.S., 47 or 74, 47, right? 47,000 census blocks in the U.S., and there are 47,000 census tracts, about 8.5 million census blocks. And so, and it is true, one of the challenges that we have is that because we didn't have the capacity to be able to say at an address level. I mean, there are policy issues around it, but there are also very big technical reasons, and that's why we've funded some grantees to actually work on address development because we don't have a complete national set of addresses in the country. So we went to block and we went to road segments and larger, and I absolutely agree with your point. One of the challenges that we have with putting out a map is that people often don't look at the caveats that we have in there. And so we did have to make an assumption for the map that, we say this is what's available in your neighborhood, but maybe not at your exact address. And in a huge number of the cases, it's going to be right. But it is, as you get out to the exurbs, it starts, that starts getting more challenging. And so, we would love, particularly, we'd love to work with you on, especially when you're looking at availability and that grant you have, how to make sure that the map is going to be most useful for you in terms of using that data set.
Thanks, Anne. Unfortunately, we're just out of time, so we're going to have to continue this afterwards. I'd like to bring up Sylvia to kind of close out, but I'd like to personally thank all the panelists for participating. I think we all learned a lot. Thanks.
Thank you, Rahul and Anne. And we'd just like to thank our sponsors one more time, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, ICF International, TIA, and U.S. Telecom. You'll see on the back of the program, our next event, July 19th, Broadband Breakfast Club, making the Universal Service Fund into a Universal Broadband Fund. And the registration link is below. And,
Invite me back?
And just thank you all for coming.